Respiratory system for semester 4 in medical school. The respiratory system is responsible for supplying oxygen, O, to the body and removing carbon dioxide, CO, a byproduct of cellular metabolism. This system involves several organs and structures that work together to ensure efficient gas exchange. A. Respiratory system structure. Nose, Nasus. The nose serves as the primary entrance for air that will be processed by the respiratory system. Inside the nose is the nasal cavity, lined with mucosa containing cilia and goblet cells that produce mucus to filter dust, pathogens, and other particles. The nasal passages warm, humidify, and filter the incoming air before it reaches the lungs. Pharynx. The pharynx is part of the respiratory tract that connects the nose and mouth to the larynx. It consists of 3 parts: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. The pharynx also serves as a pathway for both food and air, but the respiratory and digestive pathways are separated at the lower part. Larynx. The larynx, or voice box, is located below the pharynx and consists of cartilage and vocal cords. Its primary functions are to produce sound, speech, protect the airway from foreign particles through the cough reflex, and connect the pharynx to the trachea. The epiglottis is an important structure that closes the airway during swallowing, preventing food or liquid from entering the trachea. Trachea. The trachea is a tube-like structure that connects the larynx to the bronchi. It is lined with C-shaped cartilage rings that provide structural strength and keep the trachea open. The trachea contains ciliated cells and goblet cells that continually produce mucus to trap dust and foreign particles. Bronchi and bronchioles. The trachea divides into 2 main branches called the left and right bronchi. Each bronchus leads to the lungs and then branches into smaller bronchioles. Bronchioles are smaller passages that end in alveoli. They do not contain cartilage but are lined with smooth muscle that can contract or expand, affecting airflow. Lungs, pulmonary. The lungs consist of 2 main parts: the right lung, which has 3 lobes, and the left lung, which has 2 lobes. The lungs function in gas exchange, where oxygen enters the blood and carbon dioxide is expelled from the blood. Each lung is made up of delicate tissue containing millions of alveoli. Alveolus. Alveoli are tiny air sacs where gas exchange occurs. The walls of the alveoli are very thin and surrounded by capillary networks, allowing the diffusion of respiratory gases. Surfactant is a substance produced by alveolar cells that helps keep the alveolar surface dry and prevents the lungs from collapsing. B. Breathing process. Breathing involves 2 main components: ventilation, air movement, and gas exchange, diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Lung ventilation, air movement. Ventilation is the process of air moving in and out of the lungs. The two main phases in ventilation are inspiration, air intake, and expiration, air expulsion. Inspiration, inhalation. Inspiration is an active process involving the contraction of respiratory muscles. When the diaphragm, the main respiratory muscle, contracts and moves downward, the thoracic cavity expands, reducing pressure in the lungs and causing air to flow into the lungs. The intercostal muscles also contract, expanding the chest walls and assisting in the inspiratory process. Expiration, exhalation. Expiration is a passive process that occurs when the diaphragm and intercostal muscles relax, reducing the volume of the thoracic cavity and pushing air out of the lungs. Expiration can become active if the body requires rapid or deep breathing. Gas exchange. Gas exchange occurs in the alveoli. Oxygen in the alveolar air diffuses into the blood, while carbon dioxide in the blood diffuses into the alveoli to be expelled during exhalation. Oxygen diffusion. Oxygen moves from the alveoli, where the oxygen concentration is high, to the blood in the capillaries, where the oxygen concentration is low. Carbon dioxide diffusion. Carbon dioxide moves from the blood in the capillaries, where the carbon dioxide concentration is high, to the alveoli, where the carbon dioxide concentration is low. Fick's law explains that the rate of gas diffusion is directly proportional to the surface area and the concentration gradient and inversely proportional to the thickness of the diffusion membrane. C. Respiratory regulation. Breathing regulation is controlled by the central nervous system, particularly in the medulla oblongata and pons. This process responds to changes in blood gas concentrations, especially carbon dioxide, and the body's need for oxygen. Respiratory centers in the brain. Medulla oblongata. The medulla has two main centers, the inspiration center and the expiration center. These centers respond to changes in blood carbon dioxide concentration to regulate the rate of breathing. Pons. The pons helps regulate the pattern of breathing and controls the transition between inspiration and expiration. Chemoreceptors. Central chemoreceptors, located in the medulla. They detect changes in carbon dioxide concentrations and pH in cerebrospinal fluid. Peripheral chemoreceptors, located in the aorta and carotid arteries, they detect levels of carbon dioxide, O, and pH in the blood. When carbon dioxide levels in the blood increase, hypercapnia, or pH decreases, acidosis, chemoreceptors send signals to the brain to increase the rate of breathing to expel more carbon dioxide and take in more oxygen. Breathing reflexes. Cough reflex. A protective mechanism induced when foreign particles, mucus, or irritants enter the airway. Both the upper and lower respiratory passages are stimulated to expel these substances. Sneezing reflex. A reflex to clear the nasal passages of foreign particles by expelling them in a strong burst of air. D. Respiratory diseases and disorders. Several conditions can affect the respiratory system, including chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, a disease that causes narrowing of the airways, such as emphysema and chronic bronchitis, which makes breathing difficult and reduces airflow. Asthma, an inflammatory respiratory condition that causes temporary narrowing of the airways, often triggered by allergies, infections, or environmental irritants. Pneumonia, an infection of the lungs that causes inflammation in the alveoli, reducing gas exchange efficiency. Tuberculosis, TB, a bacterial infection that affects the lungs, causing chronic coughing, shortness of breath, and weight loss. Lung cancer, one of the most common cancers that affects the respiratory tract and lung tissue.